Welcome to a crazy King's Indian game between Wesley, the Kid Crush, and his fellow 2700 Dingleren, played in 2015. Without any further ado, Wesley has the white pieces and starts off with d4. We get knight f6, we get c4, g6, so planning to put the bishop on a long diagonal. Knight c3, bishop g7. Nothing fancy, we've got the King's Indian defense. Wesley continues with theory, which is e4, controlling central squares. Then we get d6, so planning to go with the pawn breaks e5 or c5 later on. We get knight to 3, continuing with development. Ding castles, we get bishop to e2, so playing a very simple game. And then we get e5, so striking at the center, but the pawn is adequately covered by the knight as well as the queen. So Wesley continued with castling, and then Ding developed knight to c6, and here Wesley pushed d5, so hitting the knight as well as closing the center. Knight goes to e7, and then we get this weird looking knight to e1. Prevents black idea of pushing the pawn, but first getting a knight to h5 in, because white would simply take twice. The plan is also to reroute the knight to a central square where it can possibly reroute to f2 later on. So as knight h5 is no longer an option, we got knight to d7, allowing the f pawn to be pushed. We got bishop to e3, continuing with development, and then we get f5, either planning to take the pawn or push. And Wesley then simply played f3, supporting the pawn. We get f4, hitting the bishop dropping back, and then we get a g5. So yeah, the idea is also pretty simple. You want to bring in your knight and start attacking on the king side. Next we got a rook to e1, knight to g6, like we mentioned. What Wesley then continued with was, c5. So what this does, it basically sacks the pawn, but you sacrifice it for activity later on, as well as the rook would then be on that semi-open file. So in the game we got takes, b4, and then Ding has to decide, because he's only got 2 squares to put his knight, but if he goes for knight to d7, it's basically lost. You can see how the bar jumped in white's favor, because the knight is coming in and it's just trouble for black. Going back, so instead of going knight to d7, we got knight to a6, so defending the pawn. In the game we got knight to d3, h5, Ding continuing with his attack on the king side. Knight to b5, so there's a lot of pressure on the c file like we mentioned, and then we get a b6 from Ding. Next we got bishop to e1, so making space for the knight to come in. Rook to f7, just supporting the 7th rank. And then we got bishop to d2, so just making space to attack later on. Bishop to f6, so here the common moves would just be to bring your rook in and align it with the king. And then we get knight to f2, queen to e8, and Wesley going in with queen to a4. So there's some indirect pressure on the knight. Ding went bishop to g8, to defend the pawn. There's a lot of pressure on the c file. Wesley drops the queen back, but still pressuring the knight. So he's preparing some tactics against the knight to possibly win his pawn. But Ding continues with his attack, now trying to open some files with g4. We get takes and takes, a knight dropping back, so there's a 2-on-1 on the knight. Ding doesn't drop back, he goes in with taking on b4, so sacking the knights for some activity. Wesley takes, and we get f3. And here, if you take the pawn, it gets pretty dangerous. So for instance, if you take the pawn, best move is actually just to bring in the queen and give back material. So in the game we got bishop to b5, hitting the queen. Queen gets out of the way. g3, closing the position around white's king. Ding goes rook to the h file with the idea of smoking Wesley. down the h file. Get queen to c4, rook to h8, and Wesley wiggles his queen into black's territory, hitting the rook on a8. But we first get this, oh no, my rook, so doubling up on the h file, and this is a mate threat, so Wesley needs to respond, and he responded with h3. And if we get g takes h, then Wesley's idea is simply to just use the pawn as a shield. So in the game we got a rook moving, knight c to d1 with a little bit of pressure on the b pawn, but it's adequately defended by the bishop and the queen. And ding hits the bishop with a6, and this is, the continuation of the madness. Wesley plays the best move, which is queen to e8 check, and you can't block with a knight because your bishop hangs. So we got king getting out of the way with a discovery on the queen, and Wesley finds the best move, ladies and gentlemen. Can you find this tactical move? Yes. Queen takes bishop, sacking the queen for bishop, and seemingly we get a rook taking, and Wesley continues noting the queen and the king are aligned, so we get a rook to c7 check. Ding blocks with the bishop to d7. We get takes and takes and takes, so absolute madness on the board, and Wesley has 3 pieces for the queen. Ding takes on h3, king hides, and a rook hitting the bishop. Bishop sliding nicely on the outpost and close to black's king. Knight to f8, hitting the bishop. Bishop drops, hitting the queen. Queen moves out of the way, and now the knight comes in, supported by the bishop, so the queen can't capture it. Get a knight to d7, bishop to h6 check from Wesley, so the pieces are beautifully coordinated. The knight supporting the bishop, and the bishop also supporting the knight. So black's queen is kind of hopeless, being dominated by Wesley's pieces. So we get king to the corner, and now the knight jumps in to glue the pieces in. Ding putting his rook on an open file, but Wesley says no, your rook is staying on the side of the board. Rook takes, and Wesley doesn't go for the fork, but captures the pawn on f3. We get Ding challenging the rook, a rook hitting the queen. We get takes and takes, and noting the pieces are quite nicely in harmony. So interesting stuff here from Wesley. We get queen getting out of the way, bishop dropping back slightly. We get Ding starting to push, but this was a blunder. The engine actually just wanted king to h7, but then Wesley goes in with a knight, hitting the queen, queen to f8, and we get Wesley pushing his pawn as well. So king coming in, now the knights are connected again, and king coming closer, hitting the bishop. Bishop drops back, and the passer starts to run. Wesley also pushes his passer, e3, running down the board, and if white takes the pawn, then he's basically just lost. So in the game we got bishop hitting the queen, and the queen can't take the bishop, because if you take it, you just lost in the game. So we got the pawn rolling, so one square away from promoting. Knight check, king moves up, queen comes off the board, Ding promotes. Wesley takes and threatens to promote on f8, and Ding gives a check here. Wesley takes another check, and king to g4, another check, and Wesley blocks with the bishop. We get another check, but the doors get shut with knight to f3, and Ding resigned in this position, ladies and gentlemen, as it's mate in 10. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you in the next one.